This is Howard Claney speaking, and in a moment we will present a ringside blow-by-blow description of the Lewis Schmeling fight.
Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!
This should be the round of the century.
Look at Holyfield! What a warrior!
If he weighs 205, his heart weighs about 204.
It happened. It happened. I can't believe it. That was astonishing, and he hurts him with a hook. Corrales takes Roger straight away. Now Castillo against the ropes. Unbelievable. Evans low. Corrales spinning. Castillo's in trouble. Reed steps in, and the fight is over. Corrales with a remarkable dramatic turnaround to win this fight.
If he gets up, he probably wins the fight. I can't believe it!
Unbelievable! Richard Steele stopped the fight with fewer than 5 seconds to go. You're going to watch Lou Duva go crazy now. You're going to watch Lou Duva go absolutely berserk.
Hello, Boxing Asylum listeners, and welcome to Punches from the Past, where we delve into the historical archives and talk about the fights that mattered. I'm Steve Wellings, and for this special show, I'm joined by Boxing Asylum stalwart Andy Patterson. This time, we're going to be covering the first and second bout between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, two bouts charged by political tension, two men representing so much more than just themselves. It was a battle for nationhood, ideology, and the World Heavyweight Championship. So much more than just a fight, Andy. Both clashes were set against the backdrop of the Second World War. Just parking the rematch for a second, what can you tell us about the build-up to the first contest?
Well, I think it's only fair to kind of mention, these two coming up. I suppose we could mention, go back as far back as the First World War. Boxing was banned in Germany at that point, and I think it was Otto Flint. He was the German heavyweight champion. He had to fight behind closed doors. But it says it was after the First World War, the returning POWs for the British camps and that they'd learned the sport of boxing, and obviously the word had got out. Schmeling he was never great at school by his own admission and stuff like that, so he excelled in sports. In 1919, I think he got the job as some sort of messenger in a German newspaper. Up until 1918 anyway, boxing was banned in Germany. And in 1921, I think Schmeling saw his first fight between, I think it was Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier in some cinema. So, he won a number of fights coming up. He was German and European champion. And over he came to America, I suppose, and he started kind of like putting a run of victories together. That kind of culminated with winning the World Heavyweight Championship against Jack Sharkey on a DQ victory. But it was kind of like marred in controversy because if you go back and watch the video, you'll see Sharkey land a very kind of low left hand to his, basically to his bollocks really, and he won the fight on a DQ. Oddly enough, actually, his manager at that time was actually Jewish, and it was something that the Nazi government or the Nazis at that time actually they accepted it, but they weren't too happy about it, at least anyway. Maybe make one defence against young Schmeling before he would lose the title to Jack Sharkey. As for Lewis, he was brought up in a kind of poor kind of crop farm before moving to Detroit. And his entire team was black, but he was kind of taught or managed to basically kind of like not to annoy, basically be the actual anti-Jack Johnson. Don't cavort with white women and stuff, and be respectful. Don't look down on your white opponents and stuff, that type of thing.
This person had to be non-threatening to white society, to white dominance, to white values. He could not gloat over opponents. He could not be seen in public with white women. He had to be seen as a Bible-reading, mother-loving, God-fearing individual, and not to be too black.
I wish he had been a vocal leader, but he did enough for me by stimulating hope and causing me as a boy to fantasize victories. And that despite everything, nobody is going to stop you from winning if you really set your mind to it. That was enough. I didn't need anything else from Joe Louis.
So he went under the tutelage of Jackie Blackburn. Now Jackie Blackburn was a fighter in his own right. Like a lot of black fighters at that time, especially in the 20s and 30s, they were basically treated like meat. They didn't get paid, or they weren't well paid anyway. And Blackburn was basically fighting for bottles of whiskey. And in the end, he was very kind of, he wasn't really all that interested about even taking on Joe Louis at one point because he was black. Chances becoming champion at that point, in that era was practically nil. I mean, we saw what Charlie Burley went through to try and get a world title shot, never got it. So he was somewhat bitter, Blackburn, and he looked at kind of Lewis. He was kind of slightly unimaginative boxer. But anyway, he started the relationship because he needed the $35 a week, or I think it was a month. I think that he got paid. He did think that Lewis slightly over concentrated on defence. He didn't really throw his punches and combinations. But as they kind of worked together and stuff, he kind of like he made this, as I say, is manufactured to kind of like outside the ring, but it was also manufactured within the ring because even though he didn't have really good foot movement, he was aggressive. He showed he had maximum power in both hands. The left hook was pretty firm, the right hand. So even though he didn't have really great foot movement, as I say, Blackburn really kind of taught him how to plant his feet firmly, shuffle forward, cut the ring off, pressure opponents and stuff. And it says, at the end of the day, if you've got that power, you're going to go places. And as you say, going into the first fight, really, I think it was a 60,000 capacity was expected. I think it was a 39,875 people had paid. There were some discrepancies in the figures because of the fact that I think the thousands were admitted at the last minute. So we were just putting a few dollars down at the gate. I think the gross gate was $547,531, with the net gross being $464,945. There was some attempted boycott by Jewish store owners at that time, actually, especially in the build-up to the first fight, because we know, as the Nazis started to kind of come to prominence and stuff, they were, around about the early 30s, they were basically kind of taking over Jewish rights, taking over their stores, type of thing. It wasn't really as blatant as it did become at that point, but the things were in motion as a result of that. Lewis's share of the gate was to be $139,000. Schmeling was to receive $150,000 tax-free, and I think the fight was delayed by one day. And believe it or not, because Schmeling was coming into that fight, he was older. He'd seen better days probably. He was an 8-1 underdog into that fight.
In my neighborhood, we thought that the German was a washed-up fighter, that it was almost a crime to bring him in to fight Joe Louis. It's going to be an embarrassment. He's going to go in and knock out this German. That's the end of that.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously the racial tension and all that was going on at the time, and I believe that both of Lewis's parents were actually the children of slaves themselves, and the Ku Klux Klan had driven Joe Lewis's parents from Alabama to Detroit when he was only 12 years old. So it was very racially charged. And I was reading a story actually. I can't remember the book or the name of the author, but it was quite a while ago that, as legend goes, Joe Louis, or Joe Louis Barrow, as he was actually known, was actually fairly interested in playing the violin. And his mother tried to get him interested in playing the violin, but he pretended that he was going to violin lessons, but really he was carrying boxing gloves in his violin case and going to the gym secretly, as you said, with Mr. Blackburn. But I think the interesting thing was, Andy, that this was the first time that America had really got behind an African-American man who was the grandson of slaves, and they really wanted him to win again because the common enemy was the Nazis and Max Schmeling. And a common misconception, I think, Andy, is about Schmeling's past. A lot of people call him the Nazi. You look at the videos on YouTube, and it's the Nazi, the German sympathizer. Schmeling wasn't actually like that, was he, Andy, with his political views? There's a lot of stories going around about him hiding Jews in his basement and stuff. And this wasn't a clash of ideologies, good against evil, as you might think.
Yeah, you're exactly right there, because you talk about, son of slaves. I think, if you look at the fight in itself as entirety, if you read the history and stuff, you will see that both were used by the governments or their own respective governments, especially in the rematch. But as you mentioned about Schmeling, I think he received a lot of criticism because he must have known what was going on in Germany at that point. He had Jewish friends, you know, as I says earlier, he was a bit of a rock star, Schmeling, coming up, because you know, he cavorted with the Jewish avant-garde. He was well known to the political elite, you know, the people in the expensive parties and stuff. He was there, wore expensive suits. You know, he was a very intelligent man, but he was like one who actually would probably he tried to play apolitical, but he always used that, you know, his connection with the Nazis. Okay, I wouldn't say he was close with the Nazis as such. I mean, I can't say that for definite, but he could go to the Nazis if he had a problem or whatever, and that they would sort it out for him. And as you says, you know, there were some Jewish friends of his who came into trouble because of the the clampdowns and stuff. He would go to the Nazi hierarchy, sometimes to Hitler himself, and ask the clemency be shown. As you quite rightly says, after the rematch, and I think it was 6 months after the rematch, you know, the night the broken glass started. I think it was about 1938. I think it was around about November 9th. Sorry, 1938, night of the broken glass.
The crystal nacht and all that type of stuff.
That was the night when Schmeling took in two young Jewish kids actually and hid them away.
And that man, known all over the world, did this for us is an unbelievable thing. This man has done for us what God didn't do. How can you explain it better?
That was major problematic for Schmeling if he got caught doing that. You know, and in the end, you know, okay, we're kind of maybe fast forwarding a bit too quick actually, but in the end, you know, as I says, Schmeling was used by his government for political purposes. They'd used them to try and promote the Olympics in Berlin to the Americans to get them to join. And Jesse Owens actually destroys the field, and Hitler's absolutely raging about it. You know, at the same time, I think you will get some detractors saying that Schmeling put his wealth and his fame before the Nazi camps and the clampdown on the Jews and the extermination camps and stuff like that. I think he must have been aware of it, but some people will basically defend him by saying that he used his popularity and he used his fame to stay close with the Nazis, to kind of get these favours, to save as many people as he could. But then you will get people saying this, you know, at the end of the day, he actually kind of overlooked for fame and fortune. And, you know, at the end of the day, when it really did hit a crescendo for the rematch and stuff, when he went to America, he was met by protesters. You know, it was classed as the free world against the Nazis and stuff. It was getting really poisonous. And, you know, before the first fight, I believe Hitler had even spoke to Schmeling, you know, when he went to America, was basically says, look, listen, just, not so many words saying, look, listen, just kind of be mindful what you say. We're, you know, tell them we're not doing these type of things that's getting reported in the papers. You know, the Jews are living freely and all that sort of stuff as well. So I think, you know, there were two sides of the coin really, and I don't think, you know, Schmeling I don't think he can be totally vindicated. He did do some great things by helping some Jews and stuff, but I think he also turned a blind eye to it at some point as well.
Yeah, as Andy mentioned there, everybody, Schmeling was a very astute man. We'll obviously touch upon this later on in the show, but afterwards he was a very astute, business-savvy man who ran, I think it was a Coca-Cola franchise, and made a lot of money after the sport. So there is the possibility that there's a lot of truth in that.
If I had a theme for Max's life, it would be that he's a survivor. He adapts to the situation. He adapts to the people he's dealing with.
While I was researching this episode, actually, I stumbled across an article by Bryn Jonathan Butler, who listeners might hear on the Nuthouse podcast on Sunday evenings from time to time. Very good writer, Bryn, very knowledgeable boxing man. And he actually wrote about this subject. I'm just going to quickly read a passage from the article because I think to do it justice, I'll just read it verbatim. Bryn writes, as Lewis entered the ring against Schmeling, a 10-year-old Maya Angelou listened on the radio in her uncle's store in Arkansas and later wrote, my race groaned. It was our people falling. It was another lynching, yet another black man hanging on a tree. This might be the end of the world. If Joe lost, we were back in slavery and beyond help. It would all be true. The accusations that we were lower types of human beings, only a little higher than apes. But Lewis won, and Angelou wrote better than anyone what that meant. Champion of the world, she wrote, a black boy, some black mother's son. Some excellent writing from Bryn there. Just going on to the fight itself, Andy, you mentioned the fights beforehand leading up. Schmeling had actually made himself known to an American audience beforehand. He'd had a few fights in America, as you said, against Jack Sharkey, twice, young Stribling. They sort of knew who he was. Just from a stylistic point of view, Joe Louis, very fit, very strong guy, real powerful puncher, by all accounts, looking at his record, nonetheless. A really good a low left hand, which came to bite him in the ass, I think, towards the end of the fight, but a really strong, powerful jab.
Max, have you discovered any particular weakness in the Brown Bomber?
Yes, I did. But I won't tell.
Lewis, yeah, definitely. Good job. As I say, he was very methodical with his punches. He, left hook, right hand, right uppercut, really good. Same as Schmeling. Schmeling was a very good boxer actually. Just going into that fight, alone, he was. As I say, I think he might be 32 at the time. Maybe I think Lewis was probably peak prime, 25, 26-year-old. At that point, nothing was going wrong for him. Actually, people, as you say, about Bryn's article there, to the black people, Lewis was like he was their protest against. They couldn't be violent in their protests. So Lewis was the man. Becoming world champion later on down the line and stuff. But so getting into that first fight, you could see Lewis. He was dominating the first round with that jab, effective aggressiveness. He was even slipping some of the uppercuts and stuff as well. But then if you look at Schmeling, as I say, he was a good boxer. He was parrying shots. He wasn't always successful in the back foot. He was trying to navigate his way around about Lewis's jab. Actually, I did think. But in terms of aggression, I think Schmeling simply looked to get some sort of jab working himself. And early in the third round, I think it was Schmeling landed quite a few quality overhand rights, stunned Lewis and prompted an immediate reaction. So you could see Lewis trying to kind of exert control of that again, pumping out a jab, as you say. Keep Schmeling on the back foot. And then late in the round, Lewis starts getting some really heavy shots home, but then it all really turns on its head in the fourth. You can see Schmeling just again, that right hand was his money shot, and if you go and look at that, that right hand that he landed, you just basically see it lands solid right on the chin, and you just see Lewis just he staggers, he stands straight up, and you can just see the legs begin to shake a wee bit, and then Schmeling just goes in and drops him in the fourth round.
The ring, Schmeling backing away cautiously, waiting for some opening that he wants. Schmeling over a right hand high on Lewis's jaw that made Lewis rock his head. Schmeling has sent Lewis down. Lewis is down.
You saw Joe Lewis's hand drop, and when that hand dropped, he came over with that right cross.
But there was it's like everything else. Boxers have always got some sort of excuse as to why they lose. And if you look at Matt Fleischer actually made some comments in the Ring magazine about it as well. But Joe had partly claimed, so did the media and that as well, that he hadn't taken the fight seriously.
You just can't get hit by right hands by a heavyweight repeatedly. I don't care who you are. You get hit enough right hands, you're going. And Schmeling could punch. And Schmeling was a good boxer. And Joe was slow and overconfident and believed nobody could beat him. And he found out different.
As I say, at that time, he was a rock star going into that fight as well, because he smashed up Max Baer in 4 rounds, King Levansky in 1 round, Primo Carnera in 6. Nobody was lasting very long with this guy. And so you just think it was just going to matter of turning up and just basically turning the guy over, because European fighters at that time coming to America, if you read some of the British history of the fighters going over there, they weren't rated. British fighter was always classed as chinny going over to America and stuff, and then you get Max Schmeling, who's this guy, so to speak, so take it easy. And, and as it transpired, actually became 1936 fight of the year.
It's interesting you mentioned a couple of names I was going to ask you about there. Lewis was obviously unbeaten before the Schmeling fight. He'd had a long run of wins, a few noticeable names. Max Baer, a very good boxer. I wondered if you could, just for a few seconds, just to give us a word on this Primo Carnera character. A lot of the listeners might not have heard of this guy, but he was the ambling Alp. He was a bit of a circus freak's a bit harsh, but he was like 6'9", was he? Which obviously now in the current era of heavyweights isn't big at all. But back then he was like a huge man, like a Nikolai Valuev of his era. Is there anything you can give us on him? This Carnera character?
Yeah, I think he was classed as about 6'6", and I think, to be honest, if you go back and read things up and stuff, they say that he was that big. He actually deserved, you say that they talk about the super heavyweights nowadays and stuff. Well, this guy back in 35, they wanted this guy to go up to, should have had a whole weight class for himself. Now, to be honest, he was actually he was controlled by the mob, and if you're controlled by the mob in that time, they decide how you're going to win and if you win, and that's the reason why he became champion. There's no two ways about it. He was, to be honest, he was awful, but at the same time, he was well built. He was great strength. He was semi-mobile, I suppose, for a guy that size. But his chin just was never going to be holding up to anything. If you look at him, some of the fights and stuff, his chin was always vulnerable. And you could just see what Lewis did to him. Actually, absolutely destroyed him. Absolutely took him apart. Just seeing him hanging there on top of that top rope in the 6th round as Lewis just beat the absolute snot out of him. It was, if you look at I think his record's quite deceiving as well. At that point in that fight, I think he was 82-7. So I'd like to know who these 82 wins were against actually, because I think a few of them would have been bought and paid for.
Yeah, not to go too far off topic, but yeah, I think he was a bit like a Valuev who was signed up originally by Bob Arum, and he was going to be the circus freak that took him around the world to Australia and all these countries. And then Arum decided that Valuev wasn't too bad after all, and they could have a run at a world title. And he was vindicated because, of course, Nikolai Valuev did pick up the WBA portion of the heavyweight titles. Not to get too far off topic here, back to the Lewis Schmeling first fight and the finish, Andy. It was all going pretty well, pretty even stuff, and it was the right hand which seemed to be the problem for Lewis throughout his career. His left was too low. Schmeling was just hitting him with right hand after right hand, and Lewis just crumbled. His stamina went. He couldn't take any more in the 12th round, and he just fell to the floor.
Lewis with hard right and left to the jaw. He has puffed up Lewis's left cheek, and Lewis is down. Lewis is down, hanging to the rope, hanging badly. He is a very tired fighter. He is blinking his eyes, shaking his head. The count is done. The fight is over. The fight is over.
Steht Joe Louis auf matten Knien im Ring, verteidigt sich noch, aber hat keine richtige Kraft mehr. Aus dem gefürchteten braunen Bomber ist ein Arm.
As I say, I don't think he really recovered for that 4th round knockdown. Actually, as I say, he just, I think, what do you call him? The fight doctor, Fede Pacheco, he made some comments on some of the stuff that I'd recycled or reviewed and stuff. I think he said it best. I don't care who you are. If you're a heavyweight taking straight right hands, you can't take them all night long. If you can't take them all night long, you're basically going to age vastly quickly overnight. But it says, as you say as well, as that right hand, he couldn't defend it. And you said the 12th round, he just basically stepped up to it. Lewis did try to kind of exert some sort of control in that 12th round, but he just got picked off the odd right hand, and an uppercut being hurt with the other right hand that staggered him to the ropes, and there was more right uppercuts. He's just, Schmeling went in for the kill, and basically the win for the winner of that fight was meant to fight for the world heavyweight title, but we'll get on to as to why that fight never happened for Max Schmeling straight away. But something that Nat Fletcher actually reported, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the excuses of a fighter when he loses a fight. Nat Fletcher reported that the idol who had replaced Jack Dempsey as the magnet slowly but surely from the 4th round was nearing the end of his reign. He seemed not only to be wobbly, but in a daze. He acted in the next 3 rounds just as he did when he was severely criticised by the scribes during the first fortnight of his training. It was lackadaisical Joe Louis who was tossing punches at his foe. He was in a complete fog. The power behind those punches of that floored Bayer, Levensky, Carnera, Retzlaff and Paulinho seemed gone. They were tame blows compared to the dynamite right hands that were landing flush on his chin with regularity round after round. And that just goes back to what Fede Pacheco was saying. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're a heavyweight taking right hands all night long, you can't take them all night. And if it was one thing that got levelled against Lewis sometimes, it was probably his chin. He did get dropped a few times throughout his career and stuff, and getting stopped like that as well. It was a defeat for America, but I think for the black population in America, and that they felt it most because that was their guy.
We invested so much in Joe Louis when he started winning. the fact that Joe Louis was winning without any dispute over white America. He was our nonviolent, violent way of expressing ourselves.
Even though the white people were coming round to Joe Louis at that point, there was a hefty white population in America that really wanted to see Joe Louis brought down a peg or two because, even though he was living, the supposed lifestyle of, being humble type of thing, he loved his woman. He loved to party.
I happened to be in different cities when he would come through, and there was always a woman in that city, although I don't know names, but I would see girls. Sometimes it would be a chorus girl or a singer from a show. He scored.
And, and people who saw that wanted to make an eye like, who's this guy? Not a Jack Johnson type thing. And they wanted to see him fail. They wanted to see him fall. And for some people, that was just desserts. But as world events started to transpire and stuff, he would become a national hero.
Yeah, and I was just looking on the box rec actually just before we started. In between the first fight and the second fight, there was a real disparity between activity between the two fighters. We've got Schmeling, who has 3 fights against fighters of reasonable credibility at that time with a few losses on the record, but then obviously back then most fighters had losses on the record, so we won't draw too many conclusions from that. But only 3 fights for Schmeling in between 36 and 38 June. Both fights took place in June. But for Joe Louis, meanwhile, he had 10 fights in that intervening period, and against a much higher class of opposition. He knocked out Jack Sharkey, who we mentioned earlier. He had a win over Jim Braddock as well. That was actually for the heavyweight world title. And then he went in with Tommy Farr as well, who was a good name, obviously sort of coming towards the end of his career. And then he defended the title in June 1938 against Max Schmeling in their rematch 10 fights later. Do we read anything into that? The fact that they've, 7 more fights for Louis, or was he just with his bum of the month club, as they said, that he was just the type of guy who kept active?
I think he was the type. I think he was the guy who actually, he took that defeat pretty badly. He knew, if rumours are true that he didn't properly prepare for that fight, he went back and basically trained like a dog just to get himself back into contention.
People think that I'm going to the ring gun shy. Why should I go to the ring gun shy when Schmeling is 2 years older and I'm 2 years smarter in boxing?
Now, people nowadays, if you look at the kind of political stuff that goes on in box nowadays, if Twitter was running about that time, actually, if you look at what happened, Schmeling should have had the world title shot against JJ Braddock, and basically what happened was there was a disinformation campaign went out by Lewis's camp. I forget who his promoter was at the minute. I know Schmeling's manager was Jimmy Jacobs, who was a Jew, and Hitler was constantly having to basically drop him in solidarity to kind of German hooding type of thing, but he refused. But the thing with Lewis's camp or his promoter, they were basically putting it out there that that the Jewish people would actually boycott a fight between Braddock and Schmeling because things were really getting to a crescendo around about 1938. I think it was around about March. I think the Germans had marched into Austria to kind of reunify the two countries, and I think around about April of that year, as well as the chances of war happening was very, very real. I think as one writer can even put it, world events made it increasingly difficult for Americans to disassociate Schmeling from the fascist homeland. The swastika hugged him like a flypaper. So I think Braddock had brittle hands. It was one thing. Every fight he was involved in, he had to basically, he would be out for a while because his hands were breaking. He had to work as a longshoreman type thing. But Lewis's camp offered him an amazing amount of money. They'd offered him the biggest guarantee. There was no figures mentioned, but they offered him the biggest guarantee at that time, and they offered him a percentage of Lewis's profits of his upcoming fights for the next 10 years. So it was a no-brainer that Braddock could basically kind of scrapped and saved for every penny. It was a no-brainer for him to go and take that fight, and Lewis duly dispatched him in 8 rounds. Now, I think Schmeling was absolutely raging at this, and I think he'd even went to the New York State Athletic Commission to basically complain about it. I think at that point there was discussions about a rematch around about 1937, and in the end, Lewis ended up fighting Tommy Farr, and it really came down to the point. I think after that fight, they say is basically that for order for the rematch to happen, Schmeling had to fight at least someone just to kind of get himself into the kind of public eye again. And that person was Harry Thomas. And that was like, that was over a year after he beat Lewis. So he goes in, he knocks out Harry Thomas in 8 rounds, and then he has 2 fights in Germany before the rematch. He's kind of finally signed and sealed. But as I says, both fighters were used for the political propaganda. Basically from the respective governments. Max was, he would be called, the German or the Nazi and stuff like that. He wouldn't be called Max or Schmeling or whatever. Like, he'd be called the German, the Nazi, and it's an ugly word, I suppose, to say, but at that time, and I'm looking through some old Ring magazine and stuff like that. Joe Lewis at that point was still called the Negro. There was newspaper articles, him looking like he's got the big baboon lips and he was like a gorilla and type of thing and stuff like that. So that kind of harps back to what we're saying as well about before the first fight. People really wanted to see Lewis get beat because he was the Negro. He was the guy that was giving the black people all this hope and stuff. They were living their dreams through him, and it was basically dragging them out of poverty and stuff, that type of thing. So going into that rematch, I think really Lewis was carrying the fate of the world on his shoulders. Actually, I think Roosevelt was even, he was a friend of Max Schmeling's, going back as early 1930s, and I think around about that point, FDR even kept. They gave Schmeling a very, very wide berth.
Yeah, Andy makes a good point there, everybody. Lewis sort of represented an aspirational view of the black man. Like, people would look at him and be inspired. Like, they would give them some kind of economic uplift, and a lot of the white population of America weren't happy with that. They were happy to side with Lewis against the Nazis, obviously, but they weren't particularly comfortable with the fact that this was the guy who was boxing against the German. Almost 2 years to the day after the first fight, they obviously went for the rematch in exactly the same location in the Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, New York.
The huge crowd, the shifting, ever-changing scene, winking pinpoints of light from 50,000 cigars and cigarettes, for all the world like fireflies in the blue-black night, reaching back until the last rows are lost in blank obscurity. The crowd makes you catch your breath.
And right in the first round, Andy, we see a more business-like Lewis. He comes out, he's focused. You can see on the footage that's available, he's staring straight down at Schmeling. It's a purposeful jab he's throwing. He's whipping left hooks. He's throwing uppercuts. He's trying to attack the body. Schmeling is trying to cover up as best as he can. He's a guy who's caught in a maelstrom of punches, really, in this first round.
Joe Lewis in his corner, prancing and rubbing his feet in the rosin. Max Schmeling standing calmly, getting last word from Doc Casey, and they're ready with a bell just about to ring. And there we are. And they got to the ring right together with Arthur Donovan Stipper and and Joe Lewis is in the center of the ring. Max going around him. Joe Lewis led quick with 2 straight lefts to the chin. Both of them light, but as the men clinch, Joe Lewis tries to get over 2 hard lefts, and Max tries him up in the breakaway clean. On the far side of the ring now, Max with his back to the hook, and Lewis hooks the left to Max's head quickly and shoots over hard right to Max's head. Lewis, a left to Max's jaw, a right to his head. Max shoots a hard right to Lewis. Lewis with the old 1-2.
Almost in the first 30 seconds, you can see the way it was going to go.
And watching for that chance, he is crowding, feeling.
You see his desire just boring in.
But his face is already
And Spider and the Fly ain't got a chance.
He's landed more blows in this one round than he landed in only 5 rounds of the other fight. And there, Max Schmeling.
He pressed. He drove Schmeling back. He rained punches. Schmeling tried to defend. He tried to counter. He tried to get out of the way.
Fighting up in a clinch and rope round. Is back against the ropes again. They're not too close to the ropes. Lewis out. And
Lewis, there's no doubt in his mind that he wants to get this fight over with. And he starts landing the right hand, ironically, himself. And the thing was that struck me, Andy, and guys maybe look back on this old fight footage and notice the same. You didn't get the full count back then. If you went down, as soon as you got back up again, the ref would throw you back in again, no looking at you to check you're okay. And that was maybe part of the downfall, I think, for Mr. Schmeling. He just wasn't able to recover, wasn't he, from these right hands?
Nah, as I say, a lot of people, if you look at it, actually, it maybe kind of carbon copy the start of the first fight a wee bit. I don't know if Schmeling was actually affected by how things were going in Germany, and the welcome that he got. Well, the lack of the welcome that he got coming back to America for the rematch. If you talk about fights getting their titles and that, this was titled the Battle of the Century, and it was really the kind of Battle of the Century, and it lasted no less than 2 minutes. I think it might have been slightly over 2 minutes actually. There was leading lawyers, industrialists, politicians. I think there was like 70,000 at Yankee Stadium for that fight. It was a live gate and $1 million. So I think that would equate to something like 10 million in today's money. I think that's incredible. Lewis, I think he was 23. I finally got that sorted out, because I did think that Lewis was kind of mid-20s at the time of the first fight, but Lewis was 23, Max was 32 at the time of the rematch. And the press, the media, they're all saying that he was fighting for Hitler. He was a Nazi. As you say, the right hand of Lewis, he just basically dominated him with it. And if you look at it, Schmeling was actually, he was kind of turned kind of side on against the ropes, and it was a right hand to the body, running about the kidney area and stuff. And if you look at it, there is a good high resolution video out there. If you actually see it, Schmeling's face just basically kind of grimaces in pain. People who were there claim he screamed like a woman.
Schmeling emitted a scream. I think everybody went, sort of like this. They had never heard a fighter scream in a high-pitched voice in agony.
Screams like a woman screams. The scream just went all through the stadium.
Again, a right to the body, a left hook, a right to the head, a left to the head, a right. Schmeling is going down. But he held to his feet, held to the rope, looked to his corner in helplessness. To the head, a left to the jaw, a right to the head. And Donovan is watching carefully. Lewis measured him, right to the body, a left hook to the jaw, and Schmeling is down.
And it later transpired, after 2 weeks in the hospital, he'd actually broke. I think he spent 6 weeks in the hospital, and the X-ray that showed he had 2 broken vertebrae in his back, and that was all off the back of that right hand of Joe Lewis. And as you say, he went down, he got back up. He got dropped again on another right hand, got straight back up again, and then he got dropped for the third time, and the fight was over.
5, 6, 7, 8. The men are in the ring. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Max Schmeling is beaten in 1 round, in less than a round.
The winner and still champion, Joe Lewis.
People are hugging each other, and black and white are embracing, women and men and strangers. And the scene is so wild. Jubilation and tears. People crying.
It was tremendous. It was almost as though we had defeated the Nazis there and then.
And even halfway through that broadcast, as he was getting beat up and stuff, the Germans pulled the live feed in the broadcast. So the Germans didn't really know what had actually happened. But in the fight in the press afterwards, the Germans had claimed that Max had been fouled, and Max refused to go along with the explanation, saying he got beat fair and square. And he returned back to Germany. He was no fanfare by saying or by going against what the Nazis had said, that he'd been fouled, and Max had said that he hadn't been fouled, that he was fairly beaten. He was basically castigated, and as the war came around, he would find himself getting enlisted.
Yeah, he found himself being enlisted. As for Mr. Lewis, I mentioned it earlier, obviously the Bum of the Month Club, I think that ran from, it was about 30 months, from 39 till 41. What this was, we were talking about here, Andy, was something that you wouldn't see these days, and something you hadn't really seen back then since the old bare knuckle times. He was defending his title so frequently against guys who were considered to be lesser opposition. Just looking back on that, would you prefer these days, Andy, guys to be more active and maybe a sort of Bum of the Month club of sorts? At least they're fighting and they're keeping going. Or are you happy with the guys the heavyweights these days, or fighters at any weight, who fight only 2 or 3 times a year? Where do you stand on that one?
Well, if you look at Lewis's record in 41, I think he fought something like 7 times, maybe defended the title 7 times. If you look at the records of some of these guys, there's Red Berman, 73 fights, 16 defeats, 2 draws. Gus Durazo, 51 wins, 9 defeats, 1 draw. Abe Simon, 34 fights, 7 defeats. You know, Buddy Bear, I think it was Max Bear's brother, 55 wins, 5 defeats, and he fought Billy Conn, 59. Billy Conn was probably one of the greatest light heavyweights ever. Maybe going, I'll say top 5. You know, he was getting beaten that fight until the 13th round. He faced him twice. You know, some of these guys that he fought, actually, you know, they had really good records. You know, some of them were winning records. But the simple fact is that, you know, Lewis was prime. He was active. He was earning great money. To answer your question, I like to see a wee bit more of it, but you only really see it nowadays is when, like, they're a prospect, they're like, you know, they start pro. So for the first 10, 12 fights and that, they maybe do that within 2 years, and then they pick up a title, and then it's all about manoeuvring into a ranking position and trying to get the right fight at the right time and stuff. There's no really kind of, like, you know, activity to kind of, like, improve, because would you rather improve by sparring in the gym or by earning money and doing it in the ring? I think there's not enough fighters nowadays willing to take that risk. You know, you can't knock, as I say, his reign. It's probably going to stand the test of time. 25 successful defences, and he's done it over 11 years, 8 months, and 8 days. And, you know, Vladimir Klitschko was short by about, what, I think it was just under 2 years. So that just shows you his dominance. Actually, I don't think, okay, bum in the month club or not, people are actually saying Vladimir Klitschko is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. He's going to be a Hall of Famer, all-time great. I think we're going to say, you know, Joe Louis, regardless of the opposition that he faced or how good his opponents were, you got to give him his due. It's not so much the winning, it's the matter and the way that he won, and most of those wins were by knockout, and you can't really knock that.
Yeah, the first fight with Lewis seemed to be the pinnacle, really, of Schmeling's career. After that, he only had a few more fights back in his native Germany, won most of them, lost a few as well. Throughout his career, pretty damn good stuff. German light heavyweight champion, European light heavyweight champion. Then he won the German heavyweight title, World Championship, obviously, and the European heavyweight championship. And as I mentioned earlier, he went into the Coke franchise. I think in the 50s, he started working for Coca-Cola, and he made a lot of savvy business decisions. Unfortunately, Andy, the same can't be said for Mr. Lewis. In the ring, obviously, Joe Louis went on, got a few more great wins, and he ended up fighting Jersey Joe Walcott a couple of times and Ezard Charles, excellent fighters, before being knocked out in 1951 for the final time against Rocky Marciano, who obviously retired undefeated. Unfortunately, Mr. Lewis had a few tax issues, a few financial problems, and it didn't really go too well between him and the taxman. And quite remarkably, when Lewis passed away in 1981, Schmeling, who was obviously very extremely financially solvent, actually paid for the funeral expenses. And I believe the friendship between the two of them, whether it was contrived, whether it was genuine, it went on, didn't it, throughout their lives after they'd retired, both of them.
It's just like Schmeling, as I says, you know, he rose for the ashes, I suppose you could say. He rose like a phoenix for, like, you know, a broken Germany. You say, I think he became a bottler in Hamburg for, like, Coke, and made a lot of money, became a millionaire, and invested that money wisely. As I say, well, I suppose after I think it was 6 months after the rematch, as we mentioned about the night of the broken glass, and 16 months after that, you know, after the Lewis rematch, you know, Germany was at war. You know, and Max was well out of favour at this point. The German high command sent him off to parachute training, and then I think he was actually even over the age draft. Actually, I think he was 33 at the time. Lewis even volunteered to join the army. Did some benefit fights. The sad fact of the matter was, you know, he donated that money to the American war effort. I don't know, he either knew or he disregarded it, but he was getting taxed on that. And at the end of the day, I think he probably became, you know, if you look at the rematch, you know, if you look at the scenes in Brooklyn and Harlem after that rematch stuff, you know, a white police chief says, you know, there was like tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of black people in Brooklyn and Harlem and stuff, and the police chief says, you know, just shut off the block, let them enjoy themselves. You know, this is their moment, so to speak.
There never was a Harlem like the Harlem of last night. Take a dozen Christmases, a score of New Year's Eves, a bushel of July 4ths, and maybe, yes maybe, you get a faint glimpse of the idea. The New York Daily News.
It was a sense of jubilation that we had, my father and I, and for the first time there was an inkling that Hitler might somehow be stopped.
Not only had he saved the honor of the country, but he gave him a tremendous moment of relief from this drudgery of pain that we were in the Depression. Man, it was tough. That night, everybody forgot the Depression.
everybody. My mother even gave me a nickel to go get an ice cream cone. That was unheard of, a nickel to celebrate, to go get an ice cream cone.
That, because he was fighting for the American ideals and stuff, to see him then having to owe Uncle Sam, I think as you say, like something like £1 million in today's money, backdated tax and that, he would need to, it was his generosity that would end up ruining Lewis, because IRS, he was handing out money to friends and his lifestyle, income tax, donations and that sort of stuff. But as you say, the two great rivals, they would play golf together. In 1950, obviously Steve off his debts, Lewis, he even became, I think he even got involved in professional wrestling at one point as well, refereeing fights, and it was sad to see him kind of get knocked out like that against Rocky Marciano. I mean, there was no way for him to go, but he ended up becoming a doorman. He was in poor health. He had a cocaine addiction. At the time of his death, he was still owed the government over $1 million. So it was sad to see them, go out like that. And I think it was, I think around about 1954, I think it was Schmeling had reached out to Lewis to basically say to him, because all this stuff was getting said in the press about the Nazis and all that sort of stuff. And I said, look, the Nazis has spoke about Joe Lewis. These words were said by Schmeling and stuff. And Schmeling says, I never said these words. And as you quite rightly says, in the end, after the war's finished, the British cleared Schmeling of any Nazi crimes or involvements and stuff like that, and became good friends with Lewis, whether it was contrived or not. They met up in public, they smiled to the cameras, and as you say, I think it was 81 or 83 when Lewis died. He paid part of the expenses for his funeral, and lo and behold, for all the good that Schmeling did, he lived on for another. I think it was for another 35, 36 years. I think he died at age 99 when Lewis went at 66. So it's funny how how life kind of turned out for both of them. One kind of grows up in a prosperous country, becomes a millionaire, loses it all. One grows up in a country, that was kind of recovering from war, becomes affluent again, gets absolutely decimated, and comes on to become a millionaire again. So it's funny how life turns around like this.
Certainly does. It's been a fascinating discussion, Andy. We're just going to draw it to a close now. As you mentioned, Lewis did indeed die in 1981. Max Schmeling passed away in February 2005, aged 99. I remember the Luan Krasniqi Lamont Brewster WBO heavyweight title fight taking place in the September of that year, and I think it was Wilfred Sauerland. The promoter made quite a big fuss and dedicated it to Mr. Schmeling, who obviously I think used to turn up ringside for the fights. He was still a fight fan, even in those advanced years. Just looking at both of their respective legacies, I think they will always be interconnected, Andy, the two of them. When you think of Lewis, you think of Schmeling, more to do with the fact of the war, the Nazism, the politically charged atmosphere. It always will push them together. For Lewis, possibly lower reaches of the top 10 of greatest heavyweights of all time, maybe pushing towards the 12-15 mark. For some observers, Schmeling obviously a lot further down the pecking order, but their names will always be linked together.
They'll always be linked. It's like Gatti and Ward, Ali, Frazier, all these great rivalries. Vasquez, Marquez. You're always going to be interconnected. You always need that dance partner. And it just so happened that it fell on the political backdrop. Some of the biggest, it's probably the biggest biggest world change ever. Actually, would lead into a war that the biggest death rate of public, of civilians and military people over the course of 10 years of war. In fact, slightly less than that actually, but they will always be linked together. If you look at the actual history of the papers and stuff like that, history won't be kind to him. If you read it, as I say, some of the stuff it was said about Lewis, about his skin colour, some of the stuff about Schmeling, about being a Nazi and stuff, and being a hater of the Jews and that, it was far from the case. As I say, I think in the end, Lewis wanted to please everybody. Same as Schmeling, he became a servant to the Nazi government. And it was the way it played out. I just think these two guys tried to kind of make the best of their respective situations. As I say, as everybody knows, the black people was kind of treated still then as second-class citizens. This was even before Ali came through, and Schmeling was obviously kind of like this rock star. He was trying to help Jewish people and stuff. But some people always say that he did turn a blind eye to it sometimes.
Excellent stuff. Thanks very much, Andy, for joining me this evening. It's been a really good discussion. I'm sure all of our Patreon listeners will have enjoyed it. Whenever we return for season 2, episode 2, hopefully we'll have a few more voices on the call. Weren't able to get too many this time, but we are hoping to add a few more fresh voices in the future if we can. Thanks everyone for listening. I've really enjoyed this, and we'll speak to you all soon. Cheers.
When Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling, he opened a door of history for every great black athlete in the coming generations who could be themselves, who did not have to mask their feelings, who did not have to hide their emotions, did not have to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to reporters.
I shook up the world! I shook up the world! I shook up the world! Wait a minute, Cash, wait a minute. You must listen to me! Now listen to me. I am the devil! All right, hold it. Ladies and gentlemen, I must tell you this. Joe, wait, hold it. They're throwing the champ, but I don't think so. All right, tell us this. All right, Cash. Thank you. Thank you, Cassius Clay, the heavyweight champion. Let's get our champion, Joe Louis, over here as the camera follows Cassius Clay.
This episode of Boxing Asylum's Punches from the Past incorporated interviews from the 2004 documentary, The Fight. The Asylum team gratefully acknowledges this film's preservation of first-hand memories of some of the most significant moments in boxing history.